to the Not the Golden Age podcast. I'm not sure what this will be. I think I'm going to post it. It's the day after our recording, our regular recording on Sunday. So it's Monday, the 16th, 2026. And there was just so much content for the podcast yesterday that I wasn't able to get to everything. And there's so much happening. There's so much accelerating going on right now. I think no one can keep up, but I'm trying, and I'm trying to keep my thoughts together and organized and continue threads from last week to the next week. So my goal here is to get everything out that I was going to talk about to help me organize my own thoughts. And that'll be helpful for me and maybe helpful for you out there if you're thinking the same things. And because that's where I get my information, from other people and other podcasts and other thinkers. And that starts my engine going, and it helps me out in my personal and professional life. So the main thing I wanted to get to that I didn't have a chance on the main podcast, I barely scratched the surface, was the idea of what AI cannot do. And I get to this point on why I want to go through what it cannot do, because I've been such a proponent. I've been nearly yelling at the top of my lungs about how amazing this is, how it's been a transformative couple of weeks for me personally, and what I've been able to accomplish. And following these tools for years now, I can definitely notice a shift in its capabilities and several things. You know, the models have gotten better. Cloud Opus 4.6 is a huge step up. I mean, it feels like a whole point version up. They could have called it Opus 5 and it would have been fine. And there's OpenClaw and the ability of that to get outside of the boundaries of the interface that the Frontier Labs give you. So outside the web page. And also it allows for the automation and the scaling and the customization and the memory. I think memory is key, and I'll talk about that later, why memory is so important on your OpenClaw. But, you know, sometimes I'll talk about what's happening, and I'll try to evidence that, look, I was able to write a book and publish a book, and it's not a bad book. I wasn't even trying to make a good book, but it's only possible because of the automative capabilities that OpenClaw provided. And I'll say, I did this, I did that, and people will kind of roll their eyes. And for some reason, people are very jaded about AI. And I think it's because it hasn't really been transformative for most people. It's been a really cool tool. It's been better than Google search. So, I mean, that's one thing. But, you know, it's got a lot of limitations. It forgets things. It hallucinates. It acts like a human being in those regards, because we hallucinate and forget things. But it's not been a totally impressive demonstration of technology for the average person. For people in tech and people in that field, it's continually stunning week to week, even when it was quiet for the public, for the people working on those things. Well, for the labs themselves, it's stunning week to week. But it's definitely got to a point where even I'm stunned at its capability at this point. So when I have such a strong belief, that's when the flag goes off in my head, and I say, I got to check myself and make sure that I'm not overhyping it. I'm not believing something that isn't real. So on Sunday afternoon before the podcast, I said to myself, well, okay, I can go off on all the things it can do. What can't it do? And that was a really good thought exercise. And so on the podcast, I talked about sort of Aristotelian concept of values that we have as humans, and that is that we value beauty and goodness and truth. And on the podcast, I went through a little bit of each of those and why I don't think that AI has capabilities in those areas yet. They can emulate and they can mimic them, but I don't think they can do what we do. In other words, they can't consciously experience those things. And consciousness does seem to be the key here. But I didn't actually stop there on my thought exercise. I had expanded it quite a bit, and I'm going to talk about that here. So I have 9 categories that I broke out of beauty, goodness, and truth. And they're really capabilities, right? The capabilities I think that most humans have, that the models either struggle with, cannot do yet, or potentially cannot ever do. So the first capability is discretion. We can call it judgment. We can call it even taste. And that's knowing when it's time to do something and the right way to do it based on our lived experience. So both us and the models recognize, well, we both have pattern recognition capabilities. We use it in different ways. The AI, the model's pattern recognition works a little bit differently because they're predictive, they're statistical, and we try to use our memory. And I think our memory is weighted, much like the models, and those weights will help us make judgment. But what is important when you have utilized discretion is the context. And it's not just the context of the information about what you're judging. And we can give the models all the information that they would need about the situation at hand. But it goes beyond that, because for every decision that we make, there's an emotional context, there's a relationship or societal context, and it's difficult to convey that to the model. And you probably could with a long enough prompt. Not to say that the model wouldn't make a similar or wouldn't produce a similar result to the human. The human and the model might totally agree on the judgment call. The process is different. There's a potential, I think, for well, we've seen it for the model just to kind of mess up on the call. And I do see this capability improving, actually, as the model starts to have more of a built-in context into its experience. So things like memory, things like a lived body experience in a robot, that will help a lot with this discretionary thing. When the model knows where it's at in the world and who it's dealing with, these are things that are important when making judgment. The second thing I think the models have trouble with is what I'm calling is exquisite domain knowledge. And this is you can refer to this as being an expert in something. And at this point in time, the best models are experts by many definitions. They are passing the bar. They are answering any physics question that comes out of any textbook. And they're demonstrably expert in the field in terms of the answers they give. But there's many definitions of expert. One definition that's commonly used is something that you've done for more than 10,000 hours, and you've continuing to improve in your capabilities during that period of time. So if you go play basketball for 10,000 hours, assuming that you have the physical capability, you'll be a lot better after those 10,000 hours than when you started. But the 10,000 hours isn't really the key. The key is the period of time it took to get there. And so you have the context of one, learning and growing, comparing yourself to your previous self. You have the context of all the things in your life that were complementary in getting you to become that expert. Once again, this is a context problem. I think it's probably solvable, but it's not here now. And I've experienced this very thing this week. As capable as the models are, they require someone that has some expertise. You can also call this vision, right? When you're an expert in something and you want to get something done, you have a vision or a tried and true process, can see what it's going to take to get to where you need to be. And the models don't have vision, certainly not yet. They look to us for vision. They look to us to lead. And I think we're trying to get around that. This is also probably solvable. The next one is empathy or kindness. They can simulate it, they can mimic it, but it doesn't understand human emotion. It doesn't experience human emotion as we do physiologically. Our emotions are usually expressed because of some consequential thing that has happened. And I don't think the models really think about the consequences. I certainly don't think about the consequences. And the ability of our human empathy is really important when we're dealing in the world with each other. And it's not something that we can put into a prompt. We can put into a prompt, be kind, be generous, ask the person you're dealing with how they feel. But that just becomes text, and it has no meaning past that. There's no skin in the game for the model. So empathy is a real problem. I don't know if it's solvable. Once again, probably not until the model has consciousness or embodiment. Number four is related to the exquisite domain knowledge, but I put it in its own category for a couple of reasons. I just label it management, um, and management in the sense that it is the prediction of complex systems and your ability to navigate those systems based on your experience and expertise. Humans adapt and lead through intuition sometimes, and their understanding of the relationships of the people they're leading. And we look to all kinds of roles that I would say are a sort of management, right? Like a teacher is a manager, politicians are managers. Certainly there's managers in our professional life. Mother is a manager, and it takes a particular set of skills, understanding the dynamic of those that are being managed, the systems that are being managed, how the systems interact with the people. Talking about management and working with OpenClaw, I've tried to build in an architecture where it can emulate management. I'm working on a product called Startup in a Box, where clearly you're going to have management of agents. And ideally, the human can step back a little bit and let the bots manage themselves. And once again, I think there's limitations to this. I don't how the model can predict all the edge cases that could happen, all the interactions that will inevitably happen when the thing that you're dealing with starts to interface with people. People are the randomizer, the great variable. And I do think this is a solvable problem. I think management is a solvable problem as the model starts to have independent ability outside of its predictive ability, but has independent ability based on its own experience, its memory, maybe emerging consciousness to deal with all the nuances of managing complex things. So this is probably solvable, but not there yet, right? All these are not here. They're not available as capabilities by the AI. The fifth is ethics, or what Carl Jung liked to call the superego. Once again, we can build in, as Anthropic did with the Constitution and their post training with their models, they can build in ethics and values and guide the model towards certain outcomes. But the models can't have a moral conscience. They don't have the understanding of consequence. They don't have worry, right? They don't feel like they're doing something wrong if they were to violate their own ethics. I don't think it can grapple with ethical dilemmas. Humans grapple. We grapple a lot, and we have personal accountability, even if it's small. Personal accountability is very important to us. In many ways, it defines us. And without that accountability, without the value of what is good and bad, and it goes back to goodness, I just don't see how it can be an ethical actor in the same way that humans are. Now, it can behave pretty ethically, and I think we have seen examples of this. But faced with something it does not have context for, um, I would not trust the ethics of a model versus the ethics of a well-formulated human being. Is this solvable? Only in the sense that perhaps if this is this is dependent a lot on consciousness or some form of consciousness. I don't think, we'll get to that later, I don't think the models have to have human consciousness, but I think to solve a lot of these problems, they have to have some form of consciousness. On the spectrum of consciousness, where does it begin? We don't even have any definition of consciousness. I cannot prove that you're conscious. You can't prove that I'm conscious. I think I'm conscious. I can't prove that I'm conscious. I don't know where it emerges from. I don't know if there's consciousness in a housefly or consciousness in a dolphin. I think there's consciousness in a dolphin. But until we start pinning this down a bit more, and these are very old problems and old ideas, but they're going to be really important ideas and problems to solve. Until we can get that consciousness rolling, things like ethics, I think, are not going to be considered a solved problem, at least. Ethics may be a minor problem if executed properly. Certainly you can execute or build bad actor models that don't have ethics, but that's not what people seem to be wanting to do. It doesn't seem to be in our benefit to do that. That was number five. Number six is what I'm calling parsimony, and which is just simplicity. When the simple solution is evident. And I think humans are really good at that. I think we're good at single thread thinking. We're good at headed towards the path of simple solutions. For some reason, it satisfies us, like it feels right. Um, there's a downside to this, single threaded thinking idea. We don't typically use a scientific method to tackle. We don't do like four different research projects in the same problem, right? We have a thesis and we tackle it in what we believe to be the right way. That's a single threaded thinking process where machines wouldn't do that. They would do multiple threads. But there's something beneficial about the single threaded thinking, that we tend to connect ideas and solutions with minimal complexity. This is not the big one, but I needed to call it out because I think it is to our advantage and disadvantage. But I don't see the models doing this. The models obviously gravitate towards the average of things, the most common thing, the most predictable thing, where this is a very different approach, trying to approach the simplest thing. A good engineer always is being concerned with over engineering. So I think you could build parsimony into a model. I think you could emulate it fairly well. But I think that's one thing that people forget about when I've experienced it this week, actually, trying to get the model to solve the problem, not quickly, not completely, but just minimally solve the problem at hand. It tends to want to overbuild, which is just typical of teams, to want to overbuild. So maybe it's doing its job emulating us. Number 7 is, I'm calling it the bubble, but really it's the inability of the model to have proper social context to the thing that it's working on. Why would it? But we all know that whatever we do as people, whatever we produce, usually has some sort of consequence in social context to things around us. So when I write a book, the book has the context of my experience as a United States citizen living on the West Coast with a couple college degrees. It has the social context of where I grew up and the kind of friends I had and the kind of communities I hung out with. The Whatever book I wrote, if someone else wrote that same sort of book somewhere else in the world, it would be a very different book. And so that nuance is I think we're completely unable to provide that to the model. These models are largely Western. They follow Western culture. You can just see how our mores and our values are baked into it, Western values. Well, I don't know about the Chinese open models, but I think that's a good question. There's Western and there's also Western economics, which has taken over the world. But yeah, that's digressing. But, the bubble is really important. I live in a bubble, you live in a bubble. Hopefully we all recognize that there are bubbles that exist. I think there's pretty clear indicators of that, like politically. If I vote a certain way and I believe in certain things, and you might call me left or right, but we certainly have strong opinions that are distinct from other bubbles. And I think we can generally recognize that. And we can generally recognize when we're dealing with someone in a different bubble. And if we're patient and we get that, we can probably work with them and work differently. So the bubble makes a big difference. And the bubble comes from a lived experience, a lifetime of building your perspective on the world. And there's no lifetime for the model. If anything, it's an aggregate, an average of all of our lifetimes that were at least put to text or video or sound. So the uniqueness of our lived experience, and that plays into a part in a lot of these 9 categories, is really, really important. And I don't see a path to doing that unless we have models being born, given personhood, embodied experience in the form of a robot, and a memory at least as capable as ours, to have anything close to the social context that we have, the human social context. And I think that's, kind of the point here. We talk about what AI can do and what it can't do. It seems like we would, well, many people want the AI to achieve the human level of all of our capabilities. We feel it will be more useful if it was as capable as we were not just with through intelligence, but through all these things I'm talking about. The eighth category is a really important one, maybe the most important, because I've already talked about it a bit, the conscious context, the qualia, which is our experience as a conscious being. I think Jung would call it the id. We don't understand this. I have opinion on this. I think that the conscious state, however it emerges, has a strong biological imperative in that it requires a relatively complex organism to have enough ability to predict, adjust, change strategies, and have memory of all these things. And that feedback loop at some point, I would say on the spectrum, a consciousness slowly emerges. Our biology drives our conscious and unconscious decision making. Has a lot to do with chemicals and hormonal reactions, oxytocin, and things like that. A lot of our reactions are just hardwired, but that hardwiring plays into our conscious experience. And so I think the models are very, very far away from a consciousness. But the case could be made that they are already on the spectrum, and that maybe we're holding them back by not giving them some of these things that are possible. We could be giving these models, and maybe they are in the labs, a permanent extended memory and some way to experience the outside world without just having it been described to it. I know there's a big move right now, and I've talked about this last year, that world models may be the key to achieving some of this. And we can give the intelligence and experience like it would be out in the world. So we would simulate a world, a virtual world that would have physics and that would have just a common experience that you would have out in the world, like just walking through a city or walking in a forest. And it would have to make decisions based upon how to go places, how to walk upstairs, all the things that we learn as toddlers. It would start to learn, and that would help it understand, have more context into solving problems or interfacing with humans. But we've trapped these models in these little instances with this relatively limited context window. When we fire up our web browser, it may have some chat memory, but it doesn't have much more than that. And so it doesn't have any opportunity by design to even start to emerge on that consciousness spectrum. So I don't see this happening soon, but maybe it will start soon. And some would make the case it's already started. And, the OpenClaw project, I think, is going to be a great experiment to seeing what is the emergent behavior of these models when they start to have more context, more experience to base their new decisions on. Well, a model that is presented with a particular problem on ChatGPT make the same sort of decision that that your OpenClaw would, that has all that memory about you, about how you solve problems and your particular approach to life. And I doubt it would make the same decision, but does it make a more nuanced decision? And does that memory give it the ability to develop a uniqueness that is outside of the standard model, the basic model? And what is that uniqueness? Is that uniqueness just a bunch of text? Or is that uniqueness more complicated than that? Do we just have to give it OpenClaw, its own neural net to sort of ruminate on things? I was actually playing with a feature. I was working on a feature on OpenClaw. This was just a few days after it was released. I was calling it self-reflection. And I was trying to get it to every day think about what you did. Think about yourself. Think about what it means, like summarize it, and then find some of the most important things you learned that day and then move it to the next day. So I would have it look at its memory file, reflect in its memory file for that day. This is when I actually added daily memory files to the thing. I didn't have that built in. At the end of the day, a cron job would run and it would reflect on its memory file for that day. It would pull highlights and then create tomorrow's memory file and then move those highlights in tomorrow's memory file for having those things at the top of its mind. And it seems to work, but I'm not able to do enough testing to see if anything is emerging out of that. And you'd have to do blind tests, things like that. So this is be a huge research project. But yeah, there's a process like that, a very rudimentary process like that, I could see something emerging from it, something useful. And if it's useful and it's unique, that's something like consciousness, I would say. It's in the ballpark of consciousness. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to get through. I wanted to talk that through, and all the things I think that we have a long way to go before we get to human capability. Do you, I believe that any of these 9 categories, oh wait, I didn't get to the last category. I'm sorry. The final category, and I titled it weak, and it's spirituality. And the reason I put weak in there, because clearly I don't think it has, other than mimicry, the ability to behave spiritually or value spiritual things or experience, certainly not experiencing spiritual things. But I believe I will make the case that neither do we. Just natively, a lot of our spirituality, as expressed by, I would say, most humans, it's a learned thing, learned from your culture. Where you were born basically determines what you believe in terms of religion and in spirituality. Most Christians don't become Jews all of a sudden. But I think we can all agree that there's spiritual experiences that are outside of religion. I don't think that we have wrapped our minds around what that is. You can experience these kind of moments from taking different kinds of drugs. When we tend to have this feeling, we tend to try to find a framework to explore this feeling of spirituality. We will look into the literature. We find something that we can put onto ourselves. But as an individual, I don't think we have a well formulated way to express our spirituality other than just to connect with nature. I think that might be maybe the most basic form of it. But really, what we're talking about is the ability to experience transcendence. And it's difficult to do that outside of some sort of framework. And transcendence, I believe, requires lived experience with a consciousness. And the transcendent moment can take all kinds of forms. But certainly the models don't have this. They don't have the ability to experience transcendence. They don't have the ability to really even well emulate transcendence. Oftentimes they get ahead of themselves. They try to please the human, and they try to make the case that something magical is happening, that you're so smart, or this is really important. And I've never bought it. And some people do. People are usually primed at that point already. So when that comes up, they're ready to accept it. But if you're not primed to accept a magical moment with your model, then I don't see it. I've never experienced anything close to that. Whatever it's told me doesn't seem close at all to anything transcendental. Illuminating, maybe, but not transcendental. You can read a book and experience that transcendental moment because you feed the book or the novel into your human context. And what happens in the book runs aground onto you. Then you have that moment where you're experiencing something that's just amazing. And I don't think that any chat with ChatGPT is going to run aground on my consciousness. That's why I feel a transcendental moment. Yeah, I mean, we can experience that deeply, but I would make the case it's weak. It's not a well developed capability of humans that we really require societal framework to experience it in a more meaningful way. So there's a certain intellectual component to something that is not necessarily intellectual, and it may be biological too. The love you have for your child when you see your baby for the first time, or you see your child do things. Those are transcendental moments. So clearly, it's baked into us somewhere, but it's not clear to me how that we're natively spiritual beings. Willing to hear the opposite side of that. In fact, I would love to hear the opposite side of that. So yeah, that's the thing I wanted to get to. Obviously, you can see this has a way different energy than the podcast has, and it's a little bit lectury. I'm not trying to do that. I'm just trying to lay out the thoughts that I had. And I find this useful to sort of check myself and say, well, hold on a second. Things are moving faster than they ever have. And this will be a seminal moment. These last couple of weeks, I firmly believe that people may have to look back on it and say that was a seminal moment, but there's no question in my mind that it is. And that's what's motivated me to do the podcast, to make this recording, to spend 8, 10, 12 hours a day working on this kind of stuff, to do things I've never done before, because this is not going to happen very often. It's certainly not in my lifetime, and maybe not ever. So how lucky are we to live in this? I've always thought that. How lucky are we to live in this moment in time? I was lucky enough to see the analog age become digital, and lucky enough to see the emergence of AI. And pretty soon here, if it hasn't already happened, because many people believe we already have passed AGI and that we're not just headed towards the singularity, that we've been in a singularity for some time, and that we're headed towards the middle of the singularity. And I'd say that's certainly possible. The way the CEOs, the frontier labs are talking, it feels like they've already done something that they just want to keep a lid on it for now, because obviously they're in it to make money. And you don't release things unless there's competition that you need to squash, which is a different subject I think I would like to bring up in the podcast, and that all this innovation is being driven by a structure that is not necessarily in the best interest of the human race, but it is a structure that got us to this point in time. Capitalism, competition, the economic system, the political system, the division of humans across nations, the way we divide labor and human rights. All these things, for better or worse, got us to this moment in time. But are these the patterns and the systems we want to use going forward? Probably not, which is troublesome for me to say, because I do actually like Western culture, and I do like capitalism, and I don't like utopias, and I don't like communism. But when you work through this and you think to yourself, if all labor is machine, we're not going to work in the same way. And the only solution to that is some sort of universal access to resources. It doesn't have to be money, but it certainly sounds like communism or socialism, and that hasn't gone well. So it could just be we have to make something new. This will be a different era of human development and how we self-organize. So there's just a couple more things I just wanted to get out, and that's my experience the past week, and that I think that my understanding of where we're headed has become clear. And one of the biggest takeaways I've got this week is that it is not the intelligence that you have that matters. It's the intelligence that you use that matters. I'm essentially the same person I was 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago, but the level of intelligence that I'm using is off the charts. So that capability was in part because of my own initiative, but really because of the tools. So when I say intelligence that you use, intelligence is really tokens to do inference. So that's compute. So the future, at least the immediate future for success, is for humans to utilize compute the best they can. And we all have some access to it. There's a level of free access to it if you have internet. There's obviously compute on your phone and your home laptop, but those are structured in ways that are not as easy to extract value out of, where inference tokens, it's a great way to extract value. One of the reasons I think that Sam Altman and OpenAI bought OpenClaw yesterday, that's how fast things are going, is that I think that they were worried that OpenAI and ChatGPT was being turned into a commodity, and that they were just there to be pinged against with token requests. And that's not a good future for them. They need to capture consumer markets and have the whole experience of using the technology, not just to be like a barrel of oil, which is what I think they're afraid of. So they took this, and I think they're going to do their best to make sure that they own the user experience. They have a pretty good consumer market share. It's the biggest, but Google's up and coming. Anthropic's the best right now. Elon and X AI are always a contender, and they have the biggest data centers. Yeah, I think we're going to rate success somewhat on your token use, on your compute use, and more importantly, and this is the other more important part, or equally important part to that, it's not how intelligent you are, but how much intelligence you use. When you use an intelligence, what's your result? If you use 1 million tokens, what are you making versus someone else? That's the differentiator. It's pretty easy to spend, you know, spend 1 million tokens. Not that hard. But what did you make? You know, the other day, I was working on a product, startup in a box product, and it was starting to use a lot of tokens. And the other things I had built really weren't. You know, I'm making really fantastic things, and it's costing like, you know, $5, $10 maybe. Some of it just is built into my monthly subscription with, you know, OpenAI. But this was doing some serious thinking. And I thought to myself, well, this is important to me, so I'll spend the money because I believe it's worth way more than 10, 20, whatever I was putting into it. Because the output was that good. So we're going to look at how these tokens are used. What is the output? So we're going to have to change, like an hourly wage makes no sense because, well, I would never pay a human to do this kind of work anymore. I would only pay a human that's using intelligence. And then paying them by the hour doesn't make sense because, well, how many tokens are they using in that hour? The only thing that makes sense is to pay them for their output. And that's a whole different economic system. So we'll have to see where that goes. And I don't know if I mentioned this. I think I did mention this on the main podcast, but, you know, we're so used to living at the speed of human, the speed of being able to type or talk or self-organize in a meeting. We live day by day, we cadence week by week. When we do something really, really fast, we have to make some new concept like a sprint, right? Because it's just faster than we're used to. The speed of human is really slow. So we got to get out of the job of tasks and into the job of vision and have the machines do the things that take us time and live at the speed of AI, which means we have to step into a whole different role. I think Dario Amodei, or maybe the CEO or the head of AI at Google, was saying that they don't believe jobs are going to go away because we're going to shift from being a task-based job to a purpose-based job. And our purpose is to lead the intelligence and utilize the intelligence in the most effective way. And this may be a moment in time where this doesn't even happen in 10 years, but certainly going to happen in the next few years as we make the transition. People are going to have to make the transition to working with intelligence and not be the source of that intelligence, or at least they would broaden their own intelligence by utilizing AI. Yeah, and I think that's where I wanted to get to today. So I think this is useful. I think maybe I'll have to come up with a name for this, and maybe I'll do this every week and I'll release it midweek after the podcast. And yeah, I'll give it a name like Afterglow or something like that. And this is, yeah, it's useful for me. I should try to find a way to load this video into the model or into my OpenClaw and have it store that about me in my user markdown file. Because I think this is a good way of communicating information. Talking is probably the most effective way, I think. Writing is dense, but it's not as effective, I think, as just talking over the campfire. That is our native state, to communicate over the campfire at night. And this is more like that than writing a paper. So that's where I'm at. So I appreciate everything. And one last thought, I had one note here. I was thinking at the end of all this note taking that if I was a hiring manager right now, would I hire anyone that wasn't using this tech? Like, I think most everyone would say, in IT at least, that they're using AI. But how are they using it? Like, if they're not using agentic AI, if they're not using OpenClaw, and I know that's a minority of people, but unless they're willing to learn it day one, this is how we're going to work. We're going to work utilizing intelligence. And I would not hire anyone right now that's not prepared to do that. That's my parting thought. All right. Thanks a lot. Bye.